The storm had been building all day over the grey mouth of the North Sea, but it broke in the evening with the sudden ferocity that makes sailors whisper even when they do not pray. Off Whitby the wind drove a small schooner toward the rocks, as if it had been thrown, not steered, its sails shredded, its deck slick with rain, the rigging thrashing like something alive. When the harbour folk ran out to watch, they saw, in a burst of lightning, the figure of a man lashed upright to the wheel, dead or dying, still holding the course with the obstinacy of duty. The vessel struck, shuddered, and lodged. A great dog, so the witnesses would say, a dog, too large and too quick for certainty, leapt from the deck and vanished into the town. Later they would find a logbook, written in a hand that had grown worse with each entry, and the last lines would read like the surrender of reason to an unseen passenger. In a century that trusted steam, rail, and science, the old maritime terror returned, that on the sea a man is never as alone as he believes. Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897, enters English literature at the moment when the Victorian confidence in progress had begun to taste of iron in the mouth. The empire was wide, the cities thick with people and soot, the laboratories busy, the newspapers incessant. Yet beneath the hum of machinery there stirred an older music, folklore, superstition, dread of the stranger, dread of the self. The 19th century had amassed facts as if facts could build a wall against the dark. But the dark had merely learned to knock in new ways. Stoker's genius was to take an antique terror, the vampire of the borderlands, and deliver it into modern London by the most modern means: contracts, shipping manifests, train timetables, medical case notes, phonograph cylinders, and typed transcripts. The supernatural arrives not in a dream, but in a file. The story is told, with a deliberateness that mimics official inquiry, through journals, letters, and memoranda. Fragments of private life assembled into a record. This form is more than a trick of suspense. It is the book's philosophy of fear. Terror, in Dracula, is not a single shock, but a slow accumulation of testimony until the mind, trained for ordinary causation, must either break or expand. The characters do what modern people do when confronted with the impossible. They document, compare, consult experts, and hope that precision will be protection. Stoker's narrative proceeds like an autopsy of disbelief. The first witness is Jonathan Harker, a young English solicitor, earnest and tidy in mind, who travels east to assist a noble client in the purchase of property. It begins as commerce, the polite extension of metropolitan order into provincial transaction. But the journey itself is the first lesson. As Harker moves from the familiar rhythms of Western Europe into the Carpathians, the trains run less punctually, the roads darken, and the faces around him carry that watchfulness which belongs to people who live with mountains and legends. In an inn he is warned, given a crucifix by a stranger as if it were a passport, and on the night drive to his destination a coach comes for him, racing through forests where wolves keep pace with the wheels and the snow seems to glow with its own pallor. The Count's land is introduced as an old frontier of Europe, where histories overlap, where empires have marched and retreated, and where the past is not past, but present in the habits of fear. Dracula's castle is the architectural embodiment of that past, ancient, isolated, impressive, and fundamentally indifferent to the human comfort that modern life has come to expect. Within it, Harker meets his host, courteous, learned, strangely compelling, and marked by physical peculiarities that the mind initially notes as mere oddity: the hair growing in unusual places, the breath that does not seem to warm the air, the pallor, the strength that exceeds expectation. The Count speaks in the language of a man who has read histories not as literature, but as autobiography. He knows England from books. He seeks it not as tourist, but as conqueror. Yet his conquest is quiet. Not armies, but tenancy and movement. Not flags, but blood. Harker's unease becomes imprisonment. The castle has locked doors and no servants. Mirrors are absent. The Count appears where he should not, and vanishes where he should be. The young solicitor, trained to trust sight and contract, is forced to rely on intuition, the oldest and least respectable of instruments. His discovery of the truth is both gross and intimate. He sees Dracula in a frenzy of animal vitality, crawling down the castle wall like a lizard. He realizes the Count has no reflection. He learns that he is not a guest, but cargo, kept alive for use. And then, in one of the novel's most insinuating scenes, Harker is approached by three women, beautiful, languid, predatory, whose seduction is a kind of assault. Here, Stoker touches a nerve that Victorian propriety could not name comfortably. Desire as danger, pleasure as a doorway through which the self can be invaded. The Count's interruption, his jealous command that the women not touch Harker, reveals a grim economy. The vampire's appetite is not only for blood, but for possession. While Harker struggles to escape, the Count executes the practical side of his plan. He has purchased an estate near London, Carfax, complete with chapels and, crucially, storage space. He ships boxes of earth from his homeland, as if importing not merely soil, but the conditions of his continued existence. He travels by sea aboard the doomed schooner, whose wreck will terrify Whitby, and as the vessel closes on England, the crew diminishes, not by storm or mutiny, but by a nightly subtraction. Stoker's maritime sequence is an old tale reclothed, the ship as a floating world, the captain as a reluctant priest, the logbook as scripture, and the sea itself as indifferent witness. When the ship finally breaks against the shore, England has received its infection. The English portion of the book begins in a gentler key: friendship, courtship, seaside walks, so that the intrusion of horror feels like sacrilege against domestic life. Lucy Westenra, fair and adored, is courted by three men of different temperaments: Arthur Holmwood, who brings aristocratic tenderness, Dr. John Seward, a modern physician and superintendent of an asylum, and Quincy Morris, an American whose candor and courage feel, in the novel's atmosphere, like a new world's antidote to old world decay. Lucy chooses Arthur. The rejected suitors, chastened, remain loyal. It is a civilized arrangement, a small triumph of character over resentment. One senses that Stoker wants to show, before the night closes in, what kind of fellowship is worth saving. Then Lucy begins to waste away. It is not the dramatic illness of earlier romances, but a baffling anemia, pallor, weakness, nocturnal wandering, a throat marked by small wounds that look too trivial to explain the decline. The doctors apply the proud instruments of modern medicine: examination, observation, transfusion. Men give their blood in acts of devotion, as if the body were a bank and love could be deposited. Yet the disease does not behave like disease. Each remedy seems to buy only a night, and each morning Lucy is further from herself. Here Stoker crafts one of his central metaphors, that life can be siphoned without a visible thief, that a person can be consumed while the household sleeps, that the enemy may be both intimate and unacknowledged. Into this clinical confusion arrives Professor Abraham Van Helsing, summoned by Seward. He is a figure Stoker designs with careful balance, not a medieval exorcist, but a scientist who has refused to let science become a prison. He knows physiology, but he also knows that the world is older than the textbooks. Van Helsing is the novel's bridge between two epistemologies. He does not abandon reason, he enlarges it. When he places garlic in Lucy's room, he is not staging theater, but applying, in his view, an empirical defense learned from a different archive of human experience. The tragedy is that Lucy and those around her cannot sustain the discipline required by a danger they do not fully accept. Safeguards are removed, windows opened, invitations made in ignorance. The vampire, like many calamities, relies less on force than on a failure of imagination. Lucy dies, and the book performs one of its grim reversals. Death is not an end, but a change of office. Reports surface of a bloofer lady who lures children in the night and leaves them with wounds at the throat. The horror is sharpened by its perversion of the maternal. The nurturing figure becomes predator. The kiss becomes bite. When the men at last open Lucy's tomb, they confront the obscene calm of the undead, her beauty preserved, her expression altered into something voluptuous and cruel. Stoker does not spare the reader the violence of what must follow. The staking is described with a terrible solemnity, as if it were both execution and sacrament. It is an act that violates the tender memory of Lucy in order to rescue what remains of her humanity. The scene reveals one of the novel's moral laws, that some evils can be ended only by deeds that stain the hands, and that purity is sometimes a luxury the good cannot afford. Meanwhile, Mina Murray, later Mina Harker, emerges as the book's quiet center of intelligence and endurance. Where many Gothic heroines are ornamental victims, Mina is an organizer. She collects diaries, types them, cross-references facts, and turns scattered dread into a coherent map. Stoker gives her a modern competence that feels almost programmatic. She embodies the virtues of the new age: literacy, diligence, rational synthesis. Yet it is precisely her intimacy with the group, her role as confidant, that makes her vulnerable. Dracula, having fed on Lucy and tasted the ease with which English life can be entered, turns to Mina as a more strategic conquest. If he can corrupt the mind that binds the men together, he can unmake their alliance from within. The vampire's attacks on Mina are among the novel's most disturbing episodes, because they are staged not merely as violence, but as enforced communion. Dracula compels her to drink from him, an inversion of nourishment, a parody of the Eucharist, an assault on autonomy dressed in the intimacy of the mouth. The act binds Mina to him with a psychic tether. She becomes unwillingly both victim and instrument. Stoker here fuses several late-century anxieties about sexuality, about contamination, about the fragility of the self, about the ways one person's violation can ripple outward to poison a whole circle of love. The men respond with a new ferocity, yet their ferocity is tempered by a particular horror, not simply that Mina may die, but that she may live as something else. The hunt becomes systematic. They discover Carfax, track down the boxes of earth, and destroy them one by one as if disinfecting a city. Stoker's London, ordinarily a monument of order, becomes a maze of crypts, warehouses, and shuttered houses, places where the modern world stores what it does not wish to see. Dr. Seward's asylum introduces another emblem: Renfield, the patient who eats flies and spiders in a grotesque imitation of nourishment and power. Renfield is often read as comic grotesquerie, but he is also an omen, a man whose appetite has been detached from meaning, who seeks life by consumption, who becomes a satellite of the vampire's will. In him, the novel hints that monstrosity is not always foreign. It can be a distortion of ordinary hunger. As the circle tightens, Dracula retreats toward his origin, carrying with him what he must preserve: the remaining earth, the secrecy, the advantage of terrain. The pursuit shifts from the metropolis to the margins of Europe, and the book's tempo becomes that of a chase across winter landscapes: trains, steamships, horseback rides, telegrams racing against twilight. Stoker delights, soberly, in the irony that the hunters rely on modern technology to combat an ancient foe, timetables and maps against superstition. Yet he also insists that technology alone is insufficient. Their true weapon is a reawakened capacity to believe in what their age has trained them to dismiss. They learn, painfully, that skepticism is not always sophistication. Sometimes it is simply blindness with better manners. The climax returns the conflict to the borderland where it began. Dracula is brought in a box like freight, as if the monstrous were only another commodity, and the final struggle takes place not in a cathedral, but in open air, under a lowering sun. There is no triumphant sermon, there is a rush of bodies, knives, and resolve. The Count's death is rendered with an economy that feels almost reluctant, as though Stoker knows that to over-explain the end would cheapen the dread that made the journey. When the vampire is destroyed, Mina is released, and the men are left with a peculiar emptiness, the kind that follows the lifting of a long fever. Some have survived, one will not. The book closes with a gesture toward ordinary life, marriage, a child, a return to daylight. Yet the reader understands that daylight has been earned, not granted. To call Dracula merely a tale of a monster is to miss its historical cunning. The vampire is a device by which Stoker dramatizes the encounter of ages. Dracula is feudal persistence, a lord who believes people exist to be used, who treats the body as property, who travels to the heart of modern commerce to feed. The Hunters are the late 19th century at its best, cooperative, record-keeping, improvisational, capable of friendship across class and nationality. Their alliance is a miniature international order, Dutch professor, English gentleman, American adventurer, built not on treaties but on trust. Stoker suggests, without preaching, that modernity's strength is not only in engines, but in its ability to form communities of purpose beyond bloodline and tradition. And yet Stoker is too honest, too attentive to the ambiguities of his time, to let the modern world appear innocent. The novel's obsession with blood is not just Gothic decor. It belongs to an era fascinated by heredity, degeneration, infection, and the thin line between health and decay. The transfusions are both tender and unsettling. The men's blood enters Lucy as a kind of communal marriage, an unspoken crossing of boundaries that Victorian decorum could not comfortably admit, even as biology made it possible. The Count, too, is an invader from the East, and the story can be read as an allegory of xenophobic fear, the anxiety that the foreign will infiltrate, seduce, and drain the imperial center. But the book also undercuts any easy nationalism. Dracula is terrifying not because he is foreign, but because he is predatory, and the English, for all their manners, are shown to be naive, complacent, and dangerously slow to imagine evil that does not announce itself in familiar forms. The endurance of Dracula lies in this fusion. It is at once an adventure, a dossier, a romance of comradeship, and a parable about the costs of disbelief. Stoker did not invent the vampire. Europe had been nursing that corpse for centuries in village stories and borderland panics, but he gave it a passport and an address, and he made it speak the language of modern appetite. In his hands, the undead becomes a metaphor broad enough to survive the century that birthed it, for addiction, for exploitation, for charisma without conscience, for the way the past can return when we assume it has been outgrown. The book ends with a child named after the men who fought the darkness, as if to say that civilization is transmitted not only by laws and institutions, but by the remembered willingness to stand together against what preys on the human, especially when it comes, as it so often does, with a gentleman's smile and an invitation to open the door.